Time now for a look at some of the day's business news, and for that we're joined here on set by Stephen Carroll from our business team. And Stephen, we're starting with the end to a rather long-running battle between Apple and Samsung.
That's right, it took 7 years, but the two world's largest smartphone makers have finally settled a dispute over the design of the iPhone. The terms of the settlement haven't been disclosed, but it is bringing to an end a long-running legal battle between the two brands. The dispute had centred on whether Samsung had copied the design, user interface and even the packaging of Apple's flagship iPhone and iPad. Now, a year after the legal action was first launched by Apple in 2011, a US jury had awarded the company over $1 billion in damages, but Samsung had appealed that decision. In 2014, the two companies settled the disputes outside of the United States over this issue, and after a retrial earlier this year, the damages awarded to Apple reduced to just under $540 million, paving the way for this final settlement that's been agreed between Apple and Samsung. Now, Apple says the case has always been about more than just the money, but industry watchers have pointed out the company had little to gain from continuing this fight, considering that Samsung no longer makes the phones in question. Well, back here in France, today is the 36th and final day of a unified strike by rail unions here. The industrial action began in April over a protest at the overhaul of the state-owned train company, the SNCF. The changes included cutting some benefits from staff and preparing the company for competition on the railways. The reform has now been signed into law by President Macron, and some unions want to continue the strikes over the summer. Maud Julien reports.
A victorious Emmanuel Macron signed into law a reform that prompted the longest transport strike in decades in France.
It's an important new chapter for our railway system, a deep transformation. I know that many rail workers were worried and that the French people have understood that. And I want to tell them that we have worked to try to answer their biggest concerns, and we will continue to do so.
The strike started on April 3rd, and for 3 months, 2 days out of 5, hardly any trains ran. The unions seemed strong and united at first. A third of the workers participated, but now that has dwindled to just 8%, and the approved reform is far from meeting the strikers' requests. It will scrap job for life and pension guarantees for new employees, turn the historically public company, the SNCF, into a joint stock company, and open the French railway system to competition. Two of the biggest unions, CGT and SUD, are calling for the strike to continue and asked workers to stay home on the 6th and the 7th of July, the first big weekend of the holiday season.
Let's check in on what's happening on the markets for you next. A mixed picture today in Asia. Some trade fears still around, but also we had some gains on energy stocks too, helped by a boost in oil prices. Tokyo closing pretty flat. The Chinese markets had been down in trading earlier, but they bounced back as the trading day has gone on there. But no great gains considering the losses that we've seen in recent days. Now, one of the things that's been upsetting the Chinese markets has been instability in the currency. And we talked about this earlier with Jamil Ahmed of FXTM. He says that currencies across emerging markets have been affected by the trade tensions.
And this is really what we're seeing broadly across the emerging markets. We're seeing great weakness in emerging market currencies, and this is something that's impacting the Chinese yuan. It's impacting currencies far away as South African rand. Even the Mexican peso has lost 3% over the past 2 weeks due to this severe lack of risk appetite in the markets. And of course, those neighboring countries to China, which are close by, such as the Malaysia and the Malaysian ringgit, Indonesian rupiah, Indian rupee, all of these currencies are suffering from this current market sentiment.
That's Jamil Ahmed there speaking to us from Cyprus a little bit earlier. Well, as European leaders gather in Brussels for a key summit discussing Brexit later, the Bank of England has warned of havoc in the financial markets if the EU doesn't act fast. Now, Governor Mark Carney says the European Union hasn't come up with a plan to clear cross-border derivative and insurance contracts once Britain leaves the EU. Those contracts worth trillions of euros. The UK government has come up with its workaround to ensure the contracts remain valid, but the EU has yet to reciprocate, and Mark Carney wants them to do so quickly. Next, unions in the United States have been dealt a blow by the Supreme Court. Conservative justices ruled that public sector employees like teachers and police officers cannot be forced to pay union fees if they're not members. That was the reaction from Donald Trump on Twitter you saw there. 24 states had required these changes. The ruling means that the 5 million non-union workers can now stop paying their dues.
This case is not anti-union. It's pro-worker. Unions can still represent workers and advocate for the things they believe in. The only thing that's changed is that workers will now have a choice, and that means that unions will have to earn workers' support instead of taking it for granted.
And finally, for me, a warning that Britain's public companies are lagging behind on their commitments to improve gender balance. The head of a UK government review into the issue found that at the halfway point since targets were set in 2016, far too many companies had either no women or only one woman on their boards. FTSE 350 companies have been told they need to have 1/3 female boards by 2020. To meet that target, the Hampton Alexander Review says 40% of all appointments to boards from now on will need to be women. Bigger firms are faring better in the UK, women there making up 29% of boards at FTSE 100 companies, but still a long way to go for some of the rest, Thomas.
Stephen Carroll with the latest business news. Thank you very much.